Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Football in Focus. As always, I'm Ryan Downey, and we're joined by Kevin O'Connell. We're presented by KO Sports and 360 Sports. Crazy times in the NFL, Kevin. I don't necessarily think that we're going to come up with anything the ESPN hasn't sort of unpacked and talked about 100 times. Suffice it to say, there's a lot going on, and I don't think we'll get to the bottom of this rabbit hole for a number of months. So if you don't mind sort of just moving on to the college weekend that I think was a great weekend, even though it's probably kind of a lesser slate than typical, being the last weekend before we get to conference play. Your game that you did for CBS Sports was Thursday night, Louisiana Tech, North Texas. Take us through that game. I was one of your many viewers that night. Seemed like a blowout early. What'd you see?
I saw a Louisiana Tech team under Skip Holtz that nobody's really given a lot of credit to, and they came in and they beat a good North Texas team that focuses on defense and not turning the ball over. Louisiana Tech beat them at their own game. Defensively, Manny Diaz, I know folks will recognize that name as he was kind of the scapegoat under Mack Brown at Texas when he was the defensive coordinator there, and kind of ousted, and it ended up being a lot more than just Manny Diaz at Texas being the problem. And I think he's a heck of a football coach, and he's doing a really nice job down there. Cody Sokol is a quarterback down at Louisiana Tech. They have a running back named Kenneth Dixon. Both these guys are all-conference caliber players, or at least having all-conference caliber seasons. And I think they're going to be a bowl team. I think they're going to be a 7 or an 8 win bowl team, and I think they're going to be right in the mix there in Conference USA. And for Skip Holtz, I mean, if you want to see some interesting things or some things that some college kids can really complain about, go take a look at their first 5 games of the season. 4 out of 5 all on the road. They play Auburn and Oklahoma throughout that stretch. They had to travel to North Texas on a short week after playing a road game, and North Texas getting to play a home game. There's a lot of things to like about this Louisiana Tech team, and on top of their performance Thursday, I just love the way they have been able to overcome a little bit of adversity and how that projects for the rest of the season.
Now, I watched the broadcast, as I gather a ton of people did, a Thursday night game, sort of a marquee game, middle of the week. Number 5, is that the receiver from Louisiana Tech that looked pretty darn explosive? Shorter guy, smaller frame, but was wildly productive in the game. I think you guys likened him to kind of that slot receiver that can have some success even at the next level.
Yeah, he was. I believe his name was Ryan Turner, and he was really solid. They had another kid named Hunter Lee who played in the slot, who are former walk-ons. That's how Skip Holtz has had to do it. They lost 39 players when Sonny Dykes left 2 years ago, and Skip Holtz was hired. They only have 6 players that have been through the program 4 years, but they have 20 or 30 plus seniors. So a lot of guys arriving on campus, a lot of guys walking on, getting a chance to play major college football that maybe wouldn't have otherwise, and these guys have all taken advantage of it. Transfers, Cody Sokol went to Iowa and then on to Scottsdale Community College. They've got Sterling Griffin, who's a receiver that transferred from LSU. They've got 4 or 5 different transfer guys. Bates is the defensive end from Illinois, who was an all Big Ten player. They've been able to kind of be a safe haven for guys that if you're not happy in your situation, come to Louisiana Tech with this new program and a bunch of new guys that are trying to get something done. And Skip Holtz has been able to do a lot of really good things there. And like I said, I expected this team to go 1-4 maybe in their first 5 games, and they're now 2-1 and playing. I think they're playing an FCS team this weekend at home in their home opener before they head out to play Auburn, maybe one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country right now.
Now, just from a broadcast standpoint, because I was watching along, sort of feeling for you, because the game wasn't very competitive from early on. I mean, North Texas didn't look like they had much of an identity. Quarterback play was, I don't want to say subpar because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but it was a challenge. What's that like broadcasting a game where you sort of run out of a competitive balance, a competitive game early on, and you got to carry the thing for a second half that people are struggling to want to tune in, not because of the product that you guys are presenting, but the product on the field?
Well, I mean, I never think about who's really tuning in, or did we just lose 100,000 people watching. I kind of think about just doing every single thing that I can do to bring the best out of both the teams we're covering down on the field. And sometimes that means having to highlight somebody not playing as well as they need to for that team to be successful. Because part of becoming a hero is you have to be the GOAT at some point. And those terms, GOAT and hero, are thrown around in broadcasts a lot. And that's how you get the guy that fumbled. That's why you get him on an ISO shot for 10 seconds after he fumbles, or the quarterback that's thrown 3 interceptions. That's why you get him walking off the field, so people at home can experience what they'd be experiencing if they were at the game. I mean, if the guy catches 3 touchdowns, your eyeballs are probably going to be watching him. How does he celebrate with his teammates? How does he, what's he doing on the sidelines? What's his mindset like? And it's the same way if he's having a tough night. That's one of the things that gives me a little bit of credibility to be up in the booth talking about it, is because I've been through it. I've thrown 3 interceptions in a quarter before. So I know when you're struggling, I know what that can feel like. I know that what it's like to play against defenses and feel like there's 15 guys on the field and you don't have a puncher's chance. So to be able to talk about that from a humbling perspective of having been there before, knowing that I came out of it, knowing that I somehow found my way back into positive territory and eventually led my team back in a game or in a season or in my career, I think that can show some things that allows us to talk about some of the negativity or talk about some of the things that aren't up to standard, but project where they may be, down the line. And I think if you're a fan of underdog stories or comeback stories, maybe that's why you tune in later on in the game to see basically maybe, hey, is he going to be able to turn this thing around? If I'm a North Texas fan, I'm definitely thinking about the quarterback position at North Texas right now and how it affects our team moving forward.
Yeah, no, it was definitely sort of you had that feel that you wanted to root for those guys that had such struggles in the first half. I was on my way to the UCLA Texas game, and I was at the airport. I forget where I was. I think I was in Denver, and you and I were texting about the Virginia Tech ECU game, sort of going back and forth about what sort of ramifications there might be for the Big Ten if Virginia Tech goes into Ohio State, beats them last week, and then looks just paltry, especially in the first half against ECU. That game could have been 48-0 in the first half. Now, your comment to me was ECU is a good team, could have gotten a win last week. It may not necessarily be a 3-alarm fire for the Big Ten now, but we've seen sort of another week where the Big Ten just doesn't look that great.
Yeah, well, let me just start out by saying ECU, I did pick ECU to beat South Carolina as kind of my upset the previous week, and they came up about a touchdown short. And I think that you not completely knowing that ECU is this, not a powerhouse, but they're a team in the American Athletic Conference, first year in the conference this year, that has some really, really good players. They've got a very good quarterback. They've got a coach there that, breeds confidence over that whole team. And in that kind of Carolina area, that school gets a lot of really good players. They get a lot of players that maybe that don't make the cut at North Carolina or South Carolina. And guess what? They have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. And when they get to play those teams, and they play really, really well. So I wasn't blown away by that. I was just blown away by their ability to score on Virginia Tech, because I thought that Bud Foster defense there under Frank Beamer, I thought they would be tough for ECU to handle for 4 quarters. I thought they would eventually make some plays that might get in their way of winning the game, but they were able to do enough. And then to lose the lead late but come right back and get it, I think that just shows you all you need to know about teams that can handle adversity and how they project moving forward. And for the Big Ten, that's just it. Do they have teams that can handle adversity? You can put out some of those fires if a team like Michigan State can reel off the next 7 or 8 in a row in a Big Ten championship. I think they can really find their way potentially into that 4th spot in the college football playoff still, because I think the SEC is going to beat up on each other, and that SEC East and West they're that crazy that stranger things have happened than a team go 11-1 and win the Big Ten championship and not find their way into the top 4.
You and I kind of talked about this in the week leading up, and I don't think either of us paid particular attention to it. But USC going across the country playing against Boston College in what was a very emotional game for Boston College, sort of dubbed as the Red Bandana game. I don't know if everybody out there is familiar with that story. If you're not, you have to Google sort of that Red Bandana game concept. An unsung hero on September 11th, back in 2001, former lacrosse player for Boston College, saved as many as 12 people in, I think it was the South Tower, and all the players wore a red bandana under their helmets, sort of after this kind of groundswell of momentum when he was recognized for his services on that day. So Boston College playing with a ton of kind of emotion and momentum, but USC thought that they were a national title contender after a couple of big wins. They go in there and they lose. What does that tell you about potentially the Pac-12, or is it just one game?
Yeah, Ryan, that Wells Crowther story, he's the hero that lost his life on 9/11 in, I believe, the South Tower, but he saved, you said it, 12, 15 people. And they really don't even know at this point how many people he helped, but watching that story, I think ESPN had that story before the game and did just an unbelievable job. And, credit to all those people for bringing out a story that could easily not be mentioned here, and they did a very nice job of bringing that back. And Boston College with the red bandana shoes and helmets and everything that they had. All that being said, that was the game that stuck with me more than anything, is the fact that USC, just when we're about to start talking about them being back, what Sarkisian's building over there, can they not only compete with Oregon every year and play that style, but can they go up to Stanford and play a physical style as well, which they were able to do the week before. I just don't know really what that says as right now about the Pac-12 as much as anything, because the Pac-12 needs more than just Oregon, because at the end of the year, hopefully Oregon has been able to kind of weather the storm, but nationally, everybody's waiting for Oregon to lose a game so they could write off the Pac-12. And I don't think that's fair. I think that we've talked about the quarterback play in the conference. We've talked about some of the defenses that are, maybe not playing their best right now. I think of a UCLA, but I know by the end of the season that team's going to be playing really good football. And if they've managed to kind of go unscathed here by, not playing their best, you could talk about that being an example of managing and overcoming adversity. So when Brett Hundley starts playing as well as we think he can, and they start figuring out a way to protect him, I think across the board, I think the Pac-12, it's very important that teams continue to play well and that Oregon's beating one-loss or undefeated teams and not 2 or 3 loss teams in that Pac-12 championship, if they're able to even make it to that game.
No, I think you're right. And I was at the UCLA-Texas game. It was obviously a very pro-Texas crowd at Jerry's World at AT&T Stadium. But UCLA traveled fairly well. I mean, 35-40% of the crowd was UCLA supporters. And when Brett Hundley went down, I think it was early in the game, maybe the second quarter, even early in the second quarter, and Jerry Neuheisel came in. They didn't throw the ball down the field but once in the entire game. Just so happened to be kind of a hitch and a deep route on the left-hand side resulted in a touchdown. UCLA's defense came up great. I talked to a bunch of the players afterwards, and they basically said it was the most fun they'd ever had in a college football game. Everybody on that team respects Jerry Neuheisel and what he's done as sort of the second or third string quarterback for his entire career there. He was channeling his inner Rick Neuheisel in the Rose Bowl from 20 years earlier. And I think that may be a game that we look back at as being critical for the Pac-12 to potentially still kind of have that torch for one of the marquee conferences. You lose to Texas, even losing your quarterback, a Texas team that is really, really down, that gets blown out by BYU the week before, and all of a sudden that's a bad loss for the conference. So kind of a good story for a young man that doesn't get a ton of playing time, where his team rallies around him. They actually lifted him up on their shoulders and carried him off the field a la Rudy at the end of that game. So it was a pretty neat kind of experience to be there for. But, just a otherwise crazy weekend in college football. I think we saw a lot of injuries that may affect the kind of standing of these teams as they move forward. Oregon lost, I think, their second and third offensive linemen. Taylor Kelly from Arizona State looks like he's going to be down for 2 or 3 weeks. We don't know when Brett Hundley's going to be back from that hyperextended elbow. Injuries are really starting to mount up for some of these big teams, and I think only time will tell to see how that kind of flushes things out.
Yeah, every single year injuries seem to be a huge determining factor in determining where teams end up at the end. Everybody can look really nice and really great in their uniforms on picture day and training camp, but when you start losing guys like Brett Hundley, as much as Jerry Neuheisel was an inspiration and as a backup quarterback for much of my career, I love seeing a guy come in and lead his team to victory. That's what you live for as you know, the backup to a guy like Brett Hundley. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's something that if he's going to have to be on the field for extended periods of time. I am not overly impressed with Texas. I don't think that they are going to be. I really don't think they're going to be a bowl team, and if they are, it's just because they win 6 games, maybe a 7th, and find their way into a bowl because they're Texas and people know they will travel well. But I definitely think the Taylor Kelly injury. I was watching that one very closely. I'm just nervous that we're not hearing the whole story there. As when you hear a broken foot, 2 to 3 weeks, and then originally Coach Graham said maybe with them having a bye and then playing next Thursday with 10 days off, maybe he'd be able to do that. That's just crazy stuff for a guy that has a ton of football, not only at the college level ahead of him, but his career potentially at the next level. He's got to be really smart about what he tries to push back from right now, and he needs to be healthy before he comes back and plays. And you start looking at some of the injuries you mentioned, the Oregon offensive line. If there's anything that has plagued them at times throughout their run as, you know, a 10-win team powerhouse under even Coach Kelly before, it's been when they haven't had that physical mindset and the ability to protect the passer. And with the way their quarterback's playing, if they can keep him upright and find a way to, even in that offense where he's moving all over the place and running 1,000 miles an hour tempo, you still got some teams on the schedule that will pin their ears back and come after your Heisman Trophy candidate. So that's definitely something to watch as well.
Yeah, we had the second week of the NFL, another crazy weekend. I think highlighted by that Sunday night game. You've got a Chicago Bears team that has 2 of the best wide receivers in football, but both severely hobbled. I'm not sure they ran routes deeper than about 15 yards in the entire game because they couldn't run away from those San Francisco corners. You've got Chicago by the end of the game down 4 starters. How on earth does Chicago win that game?
It's the NFL. It's the fact that the reason why I don't particularly know what's going to happen in any game. I mean, you take a look at any game from this past weekend, did they go exactly what you thought? If you could sit here and make predictions to me on Tuesday or Wednesday that this player is going to throw for 300 yards because this defense is terrible, or the 49ers defense is too good and those receivers are hobbled. I mean, everything you think is going to happen, just make sure you watch the game, because I know I've learned some things early on in this season that it really comes down to, I don't think we talk enough about the really good coaching that goes on in the NFL and the ability to overcome maybe some teams that as fans we sit back at home and say, man, there's no way Drew Brees is going to lose in Cleveland. Well, guess what? They play some pretty darn good defense in Cleveland, and I think the Saints might have overlooked that team. Even though they were over 0-1, they didn't match their physicality early. They were awful on third down. The offense was not able to move the football until they were really backs against the wall. And unfortunately, when you do that, your margin of error becomes razor thin. And when you have teams that are getting paid too and they're practicing a lot too, you can lose by a field goal at the end because you're not able to get a stop, and it really requires you to play in all 3 phases really, really well. So I think I would just preface it with, I know you and I talk a lot about this team versus that team, and we think this team is going to win. Just be careful about what you say, because I know I've learned, like I said, these first 2 or 3 weeks that it's almost impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen. And when you see Kansas City be 1 play away from taking the Broncos into overtime in Denver after basically laying an egg in their opener with the type of injuries, without Jamal Charles, without everything that they had to go through, and they're 1 play away from sending that thing into overtime. The NFL is crazy, and that's why I think it's the most exciting product you can possibly have on the field.
Kevin, I'm sorry about that. Google decided to just log me out of my account, so I missed the last 15 seconds of that. But sort of picking up on that thread from Cleveland, you're right. It defensively was the answer there. Now, I know you know that coaching staff, and I know you've done a little bit of coaching consulting for them. But without Tate, without Cameron, without Gordy, offensively they weren't the same team, but defensively they sure were, and they gave New Orleans kind of all they could handle. One of the guys that I wanted to highlight is sort of the 360 Sports Player of the Week. Gary Barnidge had a fantastic catch. I think it was 4th and 6th on that last drive, caught a ball in traffic amongst 3 guys that really kept that drive going for that winning field goal. So, yeah, you're right. I think the topsy-turvy nature of the NFL is such that the unpredictable is, to a certain extent, predictable. The one thing that I did want to ask you about, because quarterback play is your forte and something that you spend a lot of your time focusing on, we're in the age of kind of the really, really expensive backup quarterback. I think the highest backup is getting over $5 million in Kyle Orton in Buffalo this year. You got a lot of guys making $3 or $4 million. Kirk Cousins is a backup that's not making a ton because he's still on his rookie deal. But he played well enough backing up RG3 when he went down with the ankle injury to at least compel some to ask, is there going to be a quarterback controversy in Washington if he plays the next 3 or 4 weeks like that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there was already chatter going on because RG3 just wasn't playing well enough. And Jay Gruden is a quarterback guy. Jay Gruden didn't draft Robert Griffin III. When you have to coach for your job, which it seems like coaches are now doing in the first year of taking these jobs, the best guys need to play. And if that offense is better suited for Kirk Cousins' skill set, Kirk Cousins would start maybe at 4 or 5 or 6 teams around the league without question. And I think that he's just kind of bided his time and supported Robert Griffin III when he needed to and when he gets on the field, because Robert Griffin III has shown he's just not the most durable guy. Some people's bodies are not made to play professional football over the course of a 10-year career. And you think about some of the injuries and some of the physicality that he's had to try to overcome playing his style, you better have a good backup. And I think Washington's going to do everything they can to probably keep both those guys until, somebody offers them something for Kirk Cousins that they just can't refuse. But in the age of backup quarterbacks, you mentioned the teams that are spending $4 and $5 million on a backup. Most of the time, they're either a stopgap starter like a Matt Castle in Minnesota that's trying to carry that torch until Teddy Bridgewater's ready, or even Brian Hoyer, who's a starter. He's making, I believe, $3.5 or $4 million, but at some point he will give way to Johnny Manziel. The Kyle Orton thing, that is clearly what happens when teams are frightened about what they see on the field. And it just goes to show you that maybe their fears were not exactly coming to fruition, because E.J. Manuel's 2-0, and he's beaten 2 pretty darn good football teams. Now I think that's going to come to an end this week with the Chargers traveling to Buffalo, but we'll have to wait and see. Like I said, you never know in the National Football League. But the backup story in the NFL is something to keep an eye on, because we've seen team seasons completely fall apart when they think they have everything else in place, and then they lose that franchise guy. And look at the Houston Texans, for example, trying to play with a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick. They're figuring out a way to get it done, and I think they're doing it by the fact that they've got really good coaching and they've got a lot of really good players around that guy.
Let me ask you this. You do a ton of work with a number of San Diego media outlets, both television and radio. You break down a ton of San Diego Chargers action. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk through that game, because I know you know that team, that market, and that situation fairly intimately. Antonio Gates looks like he's 10 years younger than he is in how well he played against Seattle. I don't think a lot of people outside of San Diego gave the Chargers a whole lot of credit or a whole lot of an opportunity to beat Seattle, albeit at home. Tell us what you saw and how did that play out?
Well, what people don't understand about Antonio Gates is when he's 100% healthy, he's still one of the biggest red zone playmakers in the National Football League. Then on top of that, people don't understand that 75 to 80% of his snaps, he's dealing with things that a lot of other guys aren't dealing with. He's dealing with double teams. He's being rerouted off the line of scrimmage by linebackers and then covered by a safety or a corner at times in the red zone. Seattle tried to say, you know what, we're going to be the Seattle Seahawks. We're the champs. We don't need to double team Antonio Gates. We can cover him with Cam Chancellor. we can cover him with KJ Wright one-on-one. And they paid for it. They basically scored 3 touchdowns. Antonio Gates caught 3 touchdowns on virtually the same exact play, Ryan. It was not it was the same formation, the same route, all 3 touchdowns. Very few people realize that. And when you study it, it's just a matter of understanding what defenses are trying to take away from the Chargers. Because at times in fantasy football, I think we get carried away. Gates had 3 catches for 20 yards. He's a bum. He should retire. He has nothing left. Well, Keenan Allen had 7 for 150 because he's getting single covered on the other side of the field. What he does to the defense is still warrants that kind of attention. And I think moving forward, the fact that he was able to have this type of presence early on in the season, just wait, because guys like Ladarius Green, Eddie Royal, Keenan Allen, Malcolm Floyd, Danny Woodhead out of the backfield, these guys are going to be wide open in the red zone because teams are going to have to dictate coverage towards Antonio Gates like a lot of them were hoping they would not have to do because the Chargers have so many weapons. And I think Phillip Rivers does not get enough credit. I think the past basically 18 games now, dating back to last year and into this year, he's maybe played as well as anybody in the league, and that includes Peyton Manning. I think what he's able to do with what he has around him, what he has in front of him, played that game without his longtime center, Nick Hardwick, who's done for the season, and just able to constantly run that offense as well as anybody's running their offense around the NFL. And I have so much respect for him. And to do it against the world champs, the team that wants to be physical. It was 110 degrees on the field. A lot of guys wearing Seahawks uniforms were tapping out at times with cramps and fatigue. And I just think that around the league, you're not going to be able to simulate that for the Seahawks every time they play. In fact, I think they're going to take out a lot of aggression and frustration on the Broncos this weekend up in Seattle. But I just think that they were exposed a little bit in the blueprint. The NFL is all about blueprints. How do you beat this guy? How do you beat this team? How do you beat this offense? How do you stop Peyton Manning? The blueprint gets out on a team. Watch out, because these coaches are very, very good, and they're very good at being able to mimic what other teams were able to do to certain teams.
You mentioned earlier you have San Diego winning this week. What's the ceiling for them as a team?
Well, I think Denver is going to be tough to catch just because of the way they are so hard to prepare for week in and week out in a season. I think Denver is going to win at least 12 games, potentially 13 or 14, and probably be right up in the mix to be the number 1 overall seed in the AFC again. But I think the Chargers, they were the 3rd AFC team to get in the playoffs a year ago, and I think they're going to be right there again. I don't think the Kansas City Chiefs, as well as they played on Sunday in Denver, I don't think they're going to be where they were a year ago. The injury bug is already hitting them. But I think that the Chargers can be a 10 to 11 win team. It's just going to be how do they overcome the last 6 weeks of the season. They've historically always been so good being able to rally back. But if you take a look at that schedule, the teams that they have to play, it is just an absolute nightmare down the stretch. And they better be playing their best football, because for them to get where they should get to this year, they're going to need to win at least 4 out of their last 6, I think, in my opinion.
Well, great. Well, Kev, I think that's all the time we have today. Appreciate your time as always. You're off this week, right? You don't have a game this week?
I'm off this week. I'll be flying to New York City today and doing studio work for CBS Sports Network. I'll be on Inside College Football tomorrow night, kind of preparing everybody for the weekend ahead. I think we have a division or an FCS game tomorrow night on CBS Sports Network, so we'll have a pregame show type show, but it's more of a pre-weekend show. We'll break down Alabama, Florida. We'll break down Clemson, Florida State. We'll talk a little bit about the Pac-12, and I don't think there's really any marquee matchups, but I would keep an eye on that Washington State-Oregon game. Traveling to Pullman it's a weird trip from what I've been told, and Oregon, you mentioned some of those injuries, Ryan. Washington State and Connor Holiday could go out and put up some points and make Marcus Mariota match him step for step. So that's one to keep an eye on. But exciting weekend in college football. I think there's 8 teams with byes in the top 25. So you really got to focus in on those marquee games, because as we get throughout the season, they're going to become that much more important to figure out who's going to be playing for a national championship.
No, I think you're right. I think a lot of the teams in the Pac-12 won't admit to it, but nobody really takes that trip to Pullman, Washington very seriously. But it's one of the toughest places in the country to get to, and I've been to several kind of podunk areas in the country to watch games, and Pullman's one of the toughest places to get to. So I think you're right that could be a challenge, especially early with the depleted offensive line for Oregon. So, Kev, thanks for your time. Have a safe flight to New York. Good luck. Hope everybody checks in to see you this evening or tomorrow on the show. And then we'll be back at our normal schedule on Monday, 2 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock Eastern, for another episode of Football in Focus. Thanks, Kev.
Thanks, Ryan. Look forward to it.
Okay. So when do you leave?
I have a 12:30 out of San Diego, and